Hi guys, this video we're going to be going through how to add liquids into our Schlenk flask. We've of course got our solid reagents in there which have undergone the purge cycle, and while under a positive flow of nitrogen we can now add in our liquids. So in order to do that we need to transfer to a super seal from the glass stopper, and we're going to remove the grease prior to adding it in, just because the grease affects the seal the super seal can actually form. So we don't want any air getting in there, so we give it a little wipe and then attach the super. With the super seal then, and a positive pressure of nitrogen in there, any air that tries to get in will be forced out. So there are a few ways that we can add our liquids. When we're on the Schlenk line, we're going to be using dry and degas solvents, which are kept under nitrogen themselves prior to addition. The main way that you will come across is through needle and syringe. We use these metal needles, which are kept in a dry oven to remove any moisture from them. And we're of course just going to simply transfer a certain amount of solvent from our dry vessel here into our Schlenk flask. So attaching firmly the needle to the syringe and securing that connection in place, we're going to purge the barrel of our syringe 3 times with nitrogen, drawing it up and then evacuating it outside of the flask. So this is done to introduce as little air as possible to our vessel. We want to work in an air sensitive atmosphere, and so after 3 purges of the barrel we can then draw up our solvent here. So securing the needle to the syringe, we want to make sure that we're slowly and carefully uptaking the solvent. It's very easy for the needle to pop off if we haven't secured it in place, so even though we're actually sucking up solvent, we're still securing it onto the syringe. And then we're just getting rid of that air bubble to see the exact amount of solvent that we're taking up. And once we're happy with that, we're going to draw up a nitrogen plug, a little bit of gas, just to separate out the solvent to the air that we're going to be exposing it to as we transfer the solution over to our Schlenk flask. So we can insert our metal needle through the middle of our super seal, guiding it in, and then especially now because we're increasing the pressure onto the needle here by forcing the solvent in, we're securing it to the syringe barrel and then carefully evacuating the syringe, filling up our flask with solvent. You can see as well that we're kind of readjusting the needle position, maybe forcing it against the side of the Schlenk just to wash down any material that may have been caught on the side there as we were adding it in. So there are other ways as well to add in solvent. Sometimes you will have dry solvent which is already in a Schlenk flask or perhaps in an ampule. So this has been purged, there's an inert atmosphere in the Schlenk flask containing our solvent there, and it's under a positive pressure of nitrogen. And what we can do is we can transfer a certain amount of solvent from this flask to our reaction flask using a cannula. So cannulas here, you can get metal ones but also plastic ones, and they're just basically a tubing. And what we do is we connect up our 2 flasks, and by establishing a pressure gradient between the 2, we're able to force the solvent from one into the other, and thus putting our solid material into solution. So there's a few things that we have to do in order to set up this pressure gradient. Firstly, we're just going to tip the solvent flask slightly. This aligns it in a more horizontal position, which makes it easier for the solvent to move up the cannula. If it was in a more vertical position, you have to increase the pressure quite a lot to force the solvent up in that alignment there, so instead we tend to slant it a bit just to ease that transfer of liquid across. So the metal cannulas are a bit less flexible than the plastic ones, sometimes need to fiddle around with the relative positions of the two flasks to make sure that they're in an appropriate position to start the transfer. And you can see as well, we're trying to avoid having a big loop in the cannula in between the two flasks. If there's a big loop, then you'll find that it takes a lot of pressure to start forcing over the liquid. We want to make sure that it's relatively easy for that solution to travel across, so we're not increasing the pressure too much. So now both flasks are under nitrogen, they're under equal pressure, so we have to now create a lower pressure in our reaction flask containing our solid here. And we do this by adding a purge needle, which allows some of the nitrogen to escape, thus lowering the pressure of gas in there. And we also shut off the Schlenk arm tap here to nitrogen. So there's still nitrogen flowing in through the other flask and out here, so we're still working in an atmosphere, but it's of lower pressure now on the left hand side. By turning the nitrogen up slightly and increasing that pressure gradient, we're then going to transfer our solvent from the right hand side, and you can see it coming out the end of the cannula here and filling up the bottom of our reaction flask. So this is a less common way to transfer a dry and degas solvent into our reaction flask, but it can be used and is usually a more air sensitive way of transferring rather than using a needle and syringe. Once we've got our solution in, then it's just a case of putting a stirrer into our fume hood, and under a positive flow of nitrogen we can just stir that with our stirrer bar in there and dissolve up all our solid material.